Noam Chomsky on healthcare in America.
To take another case, we could. One of the big problems in the country, huge problem, is the dysfunctional healthcare system. The U.S. spends about twice as much per capita on healthcare as comparable countries, and has relatively poor outcomes. And tens of thousands of people are dying every year just because of lack of adequate insurance. And
68,000 people die every year in America. 300,000 of the Rona?
In fact, if you're concerned about the deficit, I think that's exaggerated, but if one is concerned about the deficit, it would be eliminated if we simply had a healthcare system like other industrial countries, which is not a utopian idea. Well, these are people's personal concerns, and they should be able to interact.
On the Katie Halper show, Noam Chomsky had told Nando Villa that it's not a radical idea to get universal health care. It's not a radical idea. Name a country that doesn't have health care. Name the countries that don't, because if every country in the world in some form or fashion has it.
Interact in ways which allow them to work out what these concerns are and what they ought to know to figure out how to overcome the problems, like why to have them investigate why it is that the United States is way off the spectrum in health and delivery of health care, and off the spectrum in the wrong direction. And the same can be true of any other case that comes along. I mean, there's a lot of concern now about what's called the decline in values of the American working class. There's a new book by Charles Murray that's, opened a lot of discussion about that. Okay.
Well, let's take the main domestic concern of Americans. For decades, the major domestic concern of Americans, or either top or very close to the top, has been the health system. Okay, that's obvious why. It's a total catastrophe. It has about twice the per capita costs of other industrial countries, and has about the worst outcomes. Like 50 million people either don't have insurance, or many more have much too limited insurance. Now, those are things that really hurt people. They're not abstract. Drug prices are like 2 or 3 times as high as in comparable countries. That hurts people, and they care about it. And furthermore, people have consistent ideas, consistent beliefs over a long period. And on this issue, they have very consistent beliefs. For decades, a large part of the population has been in favor of some kind of national health care system. It's called here single payer. It's called Canadian style. The reason it's called Canadian style is because people know that Canada exists. It's not called, Australian style, which is a better system, because who knows what they have in Australia. But there's just been overwhelming support for it. And it would almost certainly be much cheaper than the system we have now. In fact, if you take the socialized part of the system, Medicare, its administrative costs are like a fraction of the privatized system. I mean, there's constant talk about the problems that Medicare is facing down the road. We've got to do something about to stop it. Yeah, that's true. But the problems are because it has to work through the privatized system, which makes it highly inefficient, costly, bureaucratized, a lot of intervention.
Of what people see. Most popular of all, over half, was so-called public option, a government-guaranteed health care program, which is pretty remarkable because no one publicly advocates that. But it's been a consistent polling result for decades, that when people are asked what they want, they say that's their choice. And in fact, that's about the only proposal that makes any sense. The U.S. healthcare system is an international scandal. It's roughly twice the per capita costs of comparable countries, and some of the worst outcomes, mainly because it's privatized, extremely inefficient, bureaucratized, lots of bill paying, lots of officials, tons of money wasted, healthcare in the hands of profit-seeking institutions, which are not health institutions, of course. And for decades, people have preferred what every other country has in some fashion, either straight national health care or heavily government-regulated health care, like, say, Switzerland. Sometimes the support is astonishingly high. So in the late Reagan years, for example, about 70% of the population thought that guaranteed health care should be a constitutional guarantee because it's such an obvious desideratum. And about 40% thought it already was in the Constitution. The Constitution is just this holy collection of and so on. Well, the public has wanted something that makes sense, but it's not on the political agenda. Okay, very few people know that that's what everybody wants and know the reasons for it. Just it's not discussed. Okay, that's a pretty impressive achievement to have suppressed for decades. It's not that it's like everything I said, you can find the data in the papers, but you got to research it. But here's a situation where there's a major domestic concern. Population has a lot of public support. If it was even discussed publicly, the support would grow much higher. You know, when things are not discussed and debated, people may have an opinion, but their feeling is, well, I must be crazy. You know, nobody else believes this. If it was part of an ongoing lively debate and discussion, as would happen in a functioning democratic society, then people would see the reasons for it. They'd be reinforced. You'd have public pressure. Now, up until 2004, these ideas were never on the political agenda. So you go back to the 2004 election, Kerry-Bush election. Take a look at the debates and the coverage. The last debate, right before the election, it was on domestic issues. You go back and take a look at the New York Times or the Washington Post the next day. They point out correctly that Kerry never suggested any government involvement in the healthcare system because it is politically impossible and lacks political support. Okay, the only support it had was the large majority of the population, but it lacked political support and was politically impossible, which means the insurance companies didn't like it, financial institutions didn't like it, pharmaceutical corporations didn't like it, and so on. In fact, shortly after that, Congress passed legislation which made it illegal for the government to use its purchasing power to negotiate drug prices. I think the United States must be the only country in the industrial. For decades, one of the leading domestic issues for population has been the healthcare system, which is catastrophic, has twice the per capita costs of other industrial societies and some of the worst outcomes, often third world standards, aside from 47 million people with no insurance and the many millions who are underinsured. So the population doesn't like this naturally, and they have a preference, namely for a national health care system. Maybe something like extending Medicare to the whole population. Well, up until it's very interesting to see how that's handled in the intellectual culture, the media, and the political system. As late as 2004, the last election, this was occasionally mentioned, but it was regarded as politically impossible or lacking political support. Those are the words that are used. Only had the support of the large majority of the population, but that's not political support. In this election, for the first time, 2008, it's become an issue. I mean, the Democratic candidates, at least, have put forth proposals which approach what the general population wants. Industrial world where anything like that is true. So, like the Pentagon can negotiate prices, to get paper clips, let's say, but the Medicare can't negotiate to get lower drug prices. Well, now in a Medicare program was created, which is a gift to the insurance companies, since only the Democrats voted for it. All right, this year, in 2008, something changed. For the first time,
the Democrats began putting forward programs which are towards what the population has wanted for decades. They don't really get there, but at least they're in that direction. First Edwards, then Obama and Clinton. Well, what happened between 2004 and 2008? Public opinion didn't change. It's been pretty much the same for decades. What changed is that manufacturing industry started coming out in favor of a national health care system because they're being smashed by the costs of the privatized system in the United States. Like General Motors says it costs them over $1,000 more to produce a car in Detroit than across the Canadian border because they have a rational health care system, more rational, not perfect, but better. Well, you know, when a sector of concentrated American capital becomes interested in something, it starts to become politically possible and have political support. These are things that people ought to be discussing and think about. What does that tell you about functioning democracy? That something can become sort of politically possible, even if not what the public wants, only if a major sector of concentrated capital is in favor of it. Now, these ought to be topics that are, you know, the main issues for people who want to create a functioning democratic society. And that's the major domestic concern. Now, if you take a look at Obama's program today, it's being criticized because it's going to be expensive and we can't afford it. Well, yeah, the way he's planning it, it's going to be expensive because it's maintaining the privatized system. And in fact, the privatized healthcare system is complaining bitterly right now because if there's an option of a public system, as is written into the program, they won't be able to compete on a level playing field. That's a way of saying we're so inefficient and costly that we can't compete with a national health care system, so it's unfair. And Obama's proposals, such as they are now being tinkered with to help the costly, inefficient privatized system compete on a level playing field. Why should the population allow any of this to happen? Okay, there's a topic, a very different one, on which popular organizing can take place and should have been for decades, and in fact would have been if democracy was functioning. What's changed between 2004 and 2008? Not public opinion, it's the same. What's changed is that a major sector of the corporate system is now objecting to the irrationality, expense, inefficiency of the privatized healthcare system, namely manufacturing industry. General Motors says it costs them over $1,000 more to produce a car in Detroit than it does across the border in Windsor, Canada, where they have a functioning healthcare system. Well, when a major sector of corporate power enters the game, then it becomes politically possible. It tells us a lot about American democracy, as does the fact that there's no reporting on it. Try to find some mention of the reason for the change. Well, these are all internal problems in the West, serious ones. I mean, there's enormous problem, much more serious problems of functioning democracy elsewhere in the world, of course. But even in the industrial West, there's plenty to be concerned about. These are also matters of significance. It's a matter of significance, for example, that the poorest country in South America, namely Bolivia, had an election which reached a level of authentic democratic participation that we can't even dream of. Population was engaged, the majority issues were serious, people knew what the issues were. They'd been struggling about them for years, not just on voting day. They elected someone from their own ranks who was committed to significant issues that the population majority of the population decided were their own. It really doesn't happen in Western elections, certainly not in U.S. elections. Those are things we should be concerned about, too. It's not a crime. Shouldn't to be a crime in a civilized
Well,
country.
certainly, I mean, again, whether it's an ounce of cocaine his intent is to sell it.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about having a pack of cigarettes?
Having a pack of cigarettes?
That's going to kill people too. In fact, it kills a lot more people than hard drugs do.
Kind of like a cocaine and getting behind a car, you know.
No, sorry. If you want to compare it with behind a car, how about a can of beer? A can of beer is far more lethal behind a car than cocaine is. So, in fact, the matter is that having a substance should not be considered a crime because so far it's victimless. If you want to talk about distributing substances that are lethal, yeah, that ought to be brought up. But then let's be serious. Tobacco is far ahead of anything else. Alcohol is second. Hard drugs are way down the bottom. And furthermore, most drug use, though it's very harmful to the person, has very little social effect. The crime associated with hard drugs is mostly a consequence of criminalization.
Should we go after the people selling cigarettes, making cigarettes?
If the principle is let's not get lethal substances out to the public, the first one you'd go after is tobacco. The next one you'd go after is alcohol. Way down the list you get the cocaine, and sort of invisibly low you get the marijuana. In fact, there have been.
Please, I mean, you know, a lot more violence comes from someone smoking some coke.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Someone smoking a cigarette?
No, that's not true. It comes from purchasing coke and selling coke, but that's because it's illegal. That's because of the criminalization of it. That's because of the criminalization, not the effect. There are good studies of this. The consequences of tobacco doesn't happen to cause, violence, but alcohol definitely does. The deaths that are alcohol related are way beyond the deaths that are hard drug related. If you separate in the hard drug case the deaths that are the result of criminalization. So yeah, when you have drug gangs and narco traffickers fighting for turf and so on, sure, then there's going to be plenty of killings. Just like when you had Al Capone running Chicago. But that's a consequence of the criminalization, not the drugs. What drugs tend to do is make people passive. Alcohol, on the other hand, makes them violent. But they're very. I mean, there's extensive studies of this. There are extensive studies in the criminology literature, and you can take a look at the results. The basic result is that tobacco-related deaths are way beyond anything else, just an order of magnitude greater. Furthermore, those are not just to the user, they're to everybody else. So deaths from passive smoking alone are much higher than drug-related deaths from passive smoking. And furthermore, they're transferred on to the next generation. Alcohol is the next biggest. Let me begin with something that may seem pretty far afield. A film review in the New York Times a couple days ago. It begins, I'll quote it, by ridiculing America's coastal intelligentsia, which busied itself with chatter over little-seen art dramas, while everyday Americans showed up en masse for a patriotic pro-family picture, which broke all attendance records in its opening days. At the end of this quite laudatory review, the reviewer mentions that there was another film that opened at the same time, but with quite limited attendance, Selma, which was timed for release with Martin Luther King Day. Well, what was the patriotic pro-family film that so entranced everyday Americans? It's about the most deadly sniper in American history, a guy named Chris Kyle, who claims to have used his skills to have killed several hundred people in Iraq. And he wrote memoirs, and in the memoirs he describes what the experience was like. So I'll quote him. His first kill, he said, was a woman who walked into a street with a grenade in her hand as the Marines attacked her village. Chris Kyle, killed her with a single shot and explains how he felt about it. I hated the damn savages I've been fighting
savage, despicable evil. That's what we were fighting in Iraq. That's why a lot of people, myself included, called the enemy savages. There was really no other way to describe what we encountered there. The film, I read a lot of reviews. I haven't seen the film, incidentally, but I read reviews of it. They varied. The New Yorker thought it was great. They kept to the cinematic values. It's well done, nice photographs and so on. There were others who found it appalling. One of them was Jeff Stein. He's a former U.S. intelligence officer, worked in Vietnam, and he wrote a very critical review, keeping to the content. And he also recalled a visit that he made. He was invited to visit to at a Marine base to a clubhouse for snipers. And I'll quote him, "The barroom walls featured white on black Nazi SS insignia and other Wehrmacht photos and regalia. The Marine shooters clearly identified with the marksman of the world's most infamous killing machine rather than with regular troops." Well, going back to he recorded his first kill as a terrorist, this woman who walked into the street with a grenade when the Marines were attacking her village, but we can't really attribute that to the mentality of a psychopathic killer, because we're all tarred with the same brush, at least insofar as we tolerate or keep silent about official policy. And that mentality, there's very little commentary about this, incidentally, except for Amnesty International, ACLU, and so on. The mentality helps explain why it's so easy to ignore what is clearly the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern history, if not ever. Obama's global assassination campaign, the drone campaign, which officially is aimed at murdering people who are suspected of maybe some.
Need to send money internationally? Download the Western Union app. Available.
Noam Chomsky is the most quoted intellectual alive today. His books have helped me understand the nature of globalization and its effects on.
Because it's now conceded. In fact, it's now generally conceded that the hullabaloo about all the great things that were going to happen was just hype. It was intended to ram it through, and they didn't really expect it. It has nothing to do with raising the economy. It has to do with locking them into the reforms. The idea, what they call the reforms, are the so-called neoliberal structural adjustment programs that were imposed on Mexico in the early 80s, opening up the economy to foreign imports, cutting back on public subsidies, putting an end to efforts to develop the economy internally, so like import substitution and so on, essentially opening it up to foreign exploitation.